static end state solutions are not necessarily going to be able to cope with the pace at which our country is growing, our cities are growing. We have to design for the transitions.
Hello and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I'm your host Punit Gandhi, and Climate Center for Cities is excited to bring to you a podcast about the future of work in the field of climate change, urban development, sustainability, and innovation. We will talk to experts working on ground as well as in the top management of government and non-governmental organizations to better understand how their field looks like in future. This will help us in preparing to enable climate actions as well as gauge the type of skill sets and jobs that would be required in future to solve complex challenges. If you are listening to it for the first time, do tune into season 1. Hello and welcome to season 2 of Understanding the Future. I am your host Punit Gandhi, and today we have with us Rushil Pallavajjhala. He is the founder and CEO of Bandhu Urban Tech. He will help us better understand the topic of migration and climate change. Welcome to the show, Rushil.
Hi, Puneet. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be speaking about this very critical issue.
Let's start with the first basic question: is what is the root cause of migration in India? Why is there? I'm saying that some statistics put that around 14 million people move every year, or am I wrong on those statistics?
So the statistics, yes. I mean, I'd put that as a conservative number, but the official figures would usually be close to that 14 or 15 million. Unofficially, I mean, depending on who you ask, they could say it's as high as, I mean, at a very least 150 million.
Oh, wow.
But it could go up to 300 million. I think the last census perhaps put it at close to, anyway, I'm not 100% sure on this, but it's definitely much more than 15 million. So we for our purposes, we take a figure of 150 million at the very least.
Okay. And that's a huge number per se, and that's almost 10 to 12% of our population.
Yes,
what is the root
absolutely, yes.
cause of this migration in India?
So again, there are a lot of migration scholars and studies that have been done over the past, I don't know, century, I'd say. Not just in India, but in general, migration, talking about it from push factors, pull factors, and things like that. And I think both contribute. I mean, to really start from the bottom, we talk about push factors, which is typically distress, rural distress. So, that's what we see in India. And pull factors, of course, wage differential, or simply put, how much more can I earn in a city compared to a village? There are all these economic terms, right? The marginal productivity of labor being close to zero, and things like that. So in India, of course, we've seen patterns of, land is of course a limited commodity. You can't generate new land. Forest areas are protected, and increasingly, I mean, as farm sizes keep getting smaller, because larger families intergenerationally, acreage keeps getting smaller, farming starts to become more and more unsustainable. I mean, we've all these other things about, what percentage of rural areas still have rain-fed agriculture. Climate change, of course, is now playing a major role. And, in the past, around the Green Revolution, we also made a push towards monocultures to boost productivity. And again, there are several conversations around that, whether monocultures, put small agri producers at a high risk compared to, if you had a diversified cropping. So climate change, because monocultures are very susceptible, you tend to stand to, gain high or lose all. So, I mean, there are a variety of different things, all the push factors. Some of the other push factors related to pull factors is, of course, the rate at which, wages have grown in urban areas. Okay. And including things like, the Manrega that came in about 15 years, 12 years ago. It effectively increased what the minimum wage was in the village, right, with the guaranteed employment at a certain wage. And I know from experience that in construction sector in the city, where a large number of rural folk would migrate to, or skilled workers, they they saw a 4x, 5x kind of a jump immediately. So everyone now in the village says, okay, if there is this opportunity to be gained, why shouldn't I go and gain that? And typically, families that would do that would have multiple sons. Typically they would send one or two sons to the city to try and gain that higher urban wage. The other kids would stay back, help with the farm. So while there is one which is absolutely distress driven, which is landless farmers or contract labor on farm and things like that,
Yeah.
who think that farming is absolutely nothing beyond than getting your basic anaj for the year. There's another crop which says that let's get that basic done, but the opportunity is in the city.
Yeah.
So you kind of have a dual existence. So these are all the things which are, of course, fueling our rural to urban transition. And I mean, the bottom line here is that rural is rooted in agri,
Yeah.
and there are humongous inefficiencies and things which that's why a lot of agri-tech startups now are coming in to solve that. So we don't know if things get change at all, and in the new farm laws.
Yeah. Coming to one of the points that you just mentioned on lines of wages, is that considerable jump compared to the living standards in urban area when they shift to urban area, or is it just a number that looks big enough, but eventually it does not happen that much?
So yeah, this was precisely what I tried to measure through my thesis at MIT. People they would typically migrate through chain migration or word of mouth, social connect, saying that if my uncle is there, he found me something, let me go there. But based on our statistical analysis, we found that though people were making a gain in terms of the sheer difference in wages,
Yeah.
but when you come down to calculating how much you actually saved for that effort, it wasn't necessarily proportionate.
Okay.
So that is exactly the problem we want to solve, so that migrant workers or rural citizens, before they choose to migrate, they know exactly how much they'll be able to send back home or save at the end of it.
Yeah, and also there's another point that yes, there are families who generally have more than one son, try to send at least one son out. But that what happens to the female population? Like, because if they are getting married, they would generally come with the son to the city, or would they just work on farm and help the family? How would that proportion function?
In fact, the census records this. A humongous number of migrants are recorded as moving for the purpose of, marriage or family. So
Yeah.
women migrants are always, accompanying a spouse or family and things like that. I mean, rural women perhaps still don't have that agency to migrate the way men do. Did I answer the
Uh,
question on
yeah,
that?
yeah. So then I'm assuming that women also move as much as with the men move, but generally that is post marriage and not just
Yes.
for the employment cause.
Yes, yes. The only very rarely found cases, I mean, now they don't exist, where a group of girls will go and work in a larger city, but usually such people are a little better educated. They aren't your absolute menial construction labor. So they would go perhaps work in a retail store, as sales girls. They would get a job as, telecalling agent or something, or, or in a lawyer's office as a clerk. They typically be 10th or 12th passed at least,
Okay.
and are able to do this kind of work, which, and because they don't have jobs in villages once they're educated that much.
Okay. Okay. That brings me to the question that then I feel somewhere it's better for women if at least they are educated to find something in urban area than to stay back in rural area.
Yes, yes. I think, but again, it's very location specific. But given how our society is structured, in more cases than not, women will have lesser agency
Okay.
to maximize their education and their skills in a village, unless
Yes.
they become
Yes.
agri entrepreneurs or something of that sort. There.
Okay. What are the major source of work that they find in urban sector? Construction is one. They that does have like almost 10 to 12% of our GDP as well that construction caters to, and they are the one of the biggest employers of migrant laborers. But apart from that, what other kind of work do they generally end up doing in any city?
So you talk about the same group. I mean, and it's a very often quoted statistic that agriculture is the biggest employer in the country, and after agriculture comes the construction sector. Uh, and So construction is a very following the same logic. It has the least barrier to entry for unskilled or semi-skilled workers, and even the semi-skilled, it's easier to pick up. So of course that's the most obvious thing if you're not very educated.
Textile also comes somewhere close to that, but beyond that it's a bunch of various different services that aggregate to form another small fraction, and that's pretty much it. But of course there's very little reliable data that we have in the country about how this is, and of course no real time data.
But if you're slightly more educated, I mean, now we know the moment you have a driving license, it's very easy to become a partner with one of these gig delivery
Yeah.
kind of thing. A lot of people come in and join as seeing, I mean, office peon, household help, things like that. Not household help in the conventional sense, but a lot of these large companies. Manufacturing, of course, also absorbs a lot of people, but of course, nothing rivals construction as of now. I'd say the most common thing you see people doing these days is taking up stuff like security guard and things like that if they're not very educated. Because construction is it's labor intensive, it's hard work, and not everyone necessarily wants to jump into it.
Yeah. So there is as much in the sector of security guards as well that you are saying now. That's picking up.
No, nowhere close. I think it's minuscule. All of these things are minuscule. When you add them up, they can perhaps come to some percentage of the construction employment, but nothing compares to urban construction sector.
Okay.
But again, these are reports which I don't have offhand, but yeah, one could pick them up.
Yeah. I can
At
imagine
least,
that.
50%. Let me put it that way, at least 40 to 50% of people migrating to cities for seasonal work are employed in construction.
Okay. So
People
come.
migrating more permanently, sorry, people migrating more permanently or for more long-term stuff are usually better educated and will typically occupy a higher skill segment.
Okay. So yeah, that is where I was coming to next as well, was on the seasonal migration. And there are so what is the ratio that we are looking at, and why do they go back so often to their home as well if they are migrating here for work?
So seasonal, I mean, it's seasonal for a reason. Usually it's tied to agricultural cycles, and a lot of people just come to the city in the agricultural off season. And the agricultural off season, of course, depends on the soil, the climate, whether you have permanent irrigation or not. Is it only rain-fed agriculture? How many crops you get in a year? There are all these different variables. And of course, for everyone, I think it's very important to underline this. Everyone still values their social capital in the village very, very high.
Okay.
And they want to hold on to their ancestral land because if no one is looking at the land, they're scared someone might take it up, someone might kind of take over, might get encroached. So
Yeah.
they want to go back for every wedding. I mean, that's typically the story you will hear, saying I have a wedding in the family. And because communities are so closely linked, these things are very important. So in fact, when I was doing my study for my thesis, these are the two variables I hedged, that what is the loss of social capital versus how much is a wage gain. And loss of social capital, I thought was best measured by are you able to get back to your village with an overnight journey or not. So that's usually 5 to 700 kilometers in India.
Yeah.
Because this is a death. If there's anything, you want to be back in 5, 7 hours. You want to be
Yeah.
back to your. Typically, most migration clusters that see seasonal migration would like to see stuff like this. Would typically happen in closer ranges. Of course, we see longer range trends also, but more often than not, for example, Gujarat, Ahmedabad, the entire South Rajasthan tribal belts. You'll see we
Yeah.
go further down to Ankleshwar, Dahej, Surat. You'll see again tribal belts from the MP Gujarat border.
Okay.
So, and those are the guys who are pretty much dependent on rain-fed seasonal agriculture,
Okay.
who can very quickly, within 2, 3 hours, get to a large city. And Mumbai's case, you see number of migrants who come from Ratnagiri. Right?
Okay.
So it's all pretty much directly connected to transport corridors within fixed, that specific travel time.
Okay. Okay. And but that again puts them at the loss somewhere, that while they are trying to build here the economic know-how and economically they want to do well here, but because the social capital is hooked over there, how do they try and manage that kind of scenarios? Because they would also lose out on a lot of opportunities while they are gone.
Sorry, do you mean losing opportunities in the village?
No, not losing opportunities in the urban area. So while they have come to any urban area and they going back frequently also leads to, while it helps them retain the social capital, but their economic capital is going down then.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a case. I was talking to industrialists in the Bharuch, Ankleshwar area, and they said they've stopped preferring to hire locals from Gujarat, tribals who come from within 400, 300 kilometers because they keep going back and, it breaks the supply chains, it breaks their manufacturing lines. So they started to prefer people who come from further off, like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, people who are at least, 1,000, 1,500 kilometers away who find it inconvenient to keep going back home. So there's automatically a preference in the industry is built up. And I mean, yeah, so these are the obvious things you see how the markets also respond. But at the end of the day, I mean, you still can't deal with people as homo economicus, right? Not everyone, that's not the only metric that people choose. So, I mean, that, and again, that depends on communities, on various different parameters. So, well, that's how things are. Second thing they do lose out on is, I mean, if they're not stable, one reason they also keep going back is because they don't find stability in the city.
Okay.
They would be stable if they're able to bring their family, especially their kids, to the city and put them into a better school because everyone does aspire for better education for the kids. People are paying much more than they can afford for private education in several cases we've seen. And I think that's something that, let's say, has been sold well as an idea to them that education is very important.
Yeah.
And of course, cities offer that. A lot of villages you still have where you only can go up to class 7. To if you want to study up to class 10, you have to go to a neighboring village, and up to 12, another district center, and things like that. So, things stopping them from urbanizing permanently is access to stable, affordable housing that they can get, because that, fixing that location is something that enables a lot of other things to happen.
Yeah. Okay. So that is quite interesting because that's good to see that education is still somewhere they are also giving some kind of priority to, and they would like their kids to be well off in the future. How can this migration? So migration, while we are talking about climate change, is one of the essential things that we cannot look off it, because disaster prone migration has increased a lot in India as well. Especially we can see in last couple of years where cyclones and floods have hugely migrated it. So where do we come and how can we, is it possible, like I'm not even sure if we can solve it, but is it possible to balance it out? Is it possible to, have a better system for it? What can be done on those lines?
So, I mean, when you talk about balance, I don't know if it's how much of a Malthusian idea it is, but the fact is that our cities are overburdened. Urban, let's say, policymakers, planners, managers have no idea how many to design for, when to
Yeah.
design. So demand tends to be fairly uncertain when it comes. You can't handle it. I mean, you have cases where, cities have run out of water. Literally, I mean, in this case in
Yes.
Chennai, right? Recently, you have cases where Mumbai is struggling with, its local trains are running at multiple times the approved capacity. To build new structures, you have to actually cut through forests, or to build new routes through the sea. Right, that's where we've reached, and you would question if that the most sustainable way for cities to grow. And so one very obvious answer that keeps coming up is that if people socially like to remain where they are, back to their communities, how do they find employment? And I think this was again another study I had done while at MIT, that agribusiness had the highest correlation with income, higher incomes, districts with higher incomes in India. So, and I mean, some of these things also correlated with what we've observed in the past 7 or 8 years, right from the fluctuation in food prices, right? You
Hmm.
could go from in the retail, talking about retail prices, goes from anywhere, tomatoes used from 5 rupees to 100 rupees in a matter of a few months. That those are the kinds of hedging that was thing. And of course, a lot of it is to do with our supply chain. So in the last few years, you've seen how rural cold storage things have suddenly became a very fast growing asset class almost for the real estate sector. Investors in that agribusiness startups are really picking up now. I mean, the farm laws are kind of trying to talk about the same point about market rationalization of prices. There's a lot of hedging going on between how quickly can you get a perishable product out, the storage, the supply chain. So I think if you can make a lot of value addition in agribusinesses at source and raise incomes, I think that would see a tremendous, retention in source areas and perhaps lesser burden on cities. But again, one has to question, water tables and things like that. For example, where the DMIC goes through the corridor, a lot of the areas, there is a big concern about how stressed the water table is, how on a 100-year kind of projection, how prone they are to climate change risks and things like that. I mean, any major industrial hub diverts a lot of water, fresh water, from what could go to some other things. So I mean, there are several parameters to look at. So the locations in which you identify these kind of agri businesses or rural, closer to rural kind of opportunities. What is the kind of catchment area? What is the kind of infrastructure and logistics things you need to set up? So I guess that is perhaps a way to go if you do not want to have the unpredictability and overburdened cities.
No, absolutely, that's true, and this is one of the major because they generally come in, they do not have that much of capital. So more and more slums are also formed, which again causes stress in the city in some format or the other. And it's not that they are also living the best life that they could live while they are here. It's something they need to do it because they need money. That is one of the major reasons. But do you think while we develop that kind of economy for them and we try to do such things, technology can be an enabler here because they might still not be. I'm not sure. Like I guess you are better to guess over here that how will they adapt to technology? Can they do that much amount of technologically heavy stuff? What is your thought on that?
By technology, do you mean access to things like mobile phone apps? You're talking more about machinery and things like that.
So access to mobile is surely one thing, but it's also with even if they have access to mobile, can they learn it in a way that that okay, this is the weather, this comes in over here to them for their agricultural purpose. This is the kind of pesticide we are looking for or herbicide we are looking for. So I'm not sure what kind of access to technology they already have and what can, even if given, can they learn that kind of things which will help them flourish in a better way economically?
I mean, perhaps I'm not the best person to talk about how agriculturists use that kind of technology. I mean, there are lots of agri-tech startups who are doing stuff similar to that. But based on our work, what we can see is yes, there's greater penetration of technology with the younger age group
Okay.
who are usually also better educated and can operate it because typically people above 34, 35 see very low rates unless they have had education. We see very low rates of adoption of technology like mobile platforms and things like that. And I mean, in certain areas, of course, connectivity is a major issue. I mean, you go to certain parts of Odisha, you still, most of the things, you don't get data, you don't get your mobile phone towers. So I think that should also change. In every case, I think right from falling data rates, falling mobile phone subscription rates, by rates, I mean price, the younger generation being a little better educated, more savvy with, using smartphones, I think this should change around. And I think you will see greater and greater adoption of the kinds of technologies that we already looking at, future technologies that are mass delivered through things like mobile platforms and stuff.
Okay. And so bringing in the work that you do over here and connect the employer and employee, how is that so that also builds up their capital in terms of not just economic, but I guess because you guys have a rating system and all helps them in a better way. How does that function and how are they responding to it on those lines?
See, I think people who are using technology are fairly familiar with rating systems. And I think this is something which is a legacy that has come the last decade or so of people using platforms like Ola, Uber, and now Swiggy. Like every Swiggy delivery boy, he'll tell you, give me a good rating. So I think people are sensitive to ratings. They're scared that, oh, my rating might go down and incentives might go down. So I think that's definitely it's become a language that's understood commonly. Again, in the construction sector, it's very, very early days of people, because there's no product really in the construction sector and things like that. And we are dealing with people who are generally lower on the education spectrum. So it's a harder challenge than it is in the service sector, the logistics sector. But it's definitely something we are seeing picking up. Of course, the employers love it, right? Because lack of standardized metrics to hire at bulk has always been an issue that industry has complained about. Access to skilled workers, knowing whether I'm giving the right price to the right kind of person. So both ways, I think people will, demand and supply side, both side people will, kind of be more and more keen to see this spread.
Okay. So that sounds at least promising enough for that hopefully technology will help them as well as people who are employing them, because that is eventually better for the whole ecosystem over there. And in terms of climate change, while there is a push, agriculture is highly affected because of unseasonal rains or heavy rainfalls in short term and things like that. There is also now a threat for them in urban society, because majority of slums or low affordable housing are in areas which might not be absolutely habitable. So I'll say that they are closer to somehow areas which might get flooded or something or the other, specifically slums, I'll say. So how do you think that response will now take place? Because that is where now the next set of problems we foresee, that as climate change happens and happens in urban areas as well, they are the first ones to get affected again. So how do you see that something like that can be solved?
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. The supply of urban land is the biggest problem that we have in cities, especially for housing, and invariably the worst land in terms of water collection or whether it's a former lake. Literally, those are kinds of lands where low-income things happen. Now, in terms of how is that going to change, it's a really hard one to answer, because even if governments go out and say that we will not have anyone build here, the reality is there's so many slums which are technically called untenable, and they're practically built on a riverbed or a lake bed. Lakes that perhaps fill in have a once in a 50-year kind of cycle. The second thing, which of course happens, is the infrastructure and how we build it, which very often disrupts how water flows across a landscape, and very often it becomes almost like a check dam, which encourages water collection on one side of a road and things like that. I think it's a very, very common issue. So I think the real way to solve it will be to start taking a more data-driven, high-level approach to how we are building. Of course, one looks at the topography and things like that, and which are the likely places for, let's say, so-called illegal slum aggregation and things like that. I think we need to start preempting a lot of these things, start preempting where growth will happen based on where economic opportunities are being generated, and ideally be able to connect those things with solid trunk infrastructure or transport, which maybe this place is like a 15-kilometer zone outside a city, but it's well connected with transport. And we need to actually then, ideally from an urban planner point of view, leave out certain chunks as completely untenable for any kind of construction, maybe talk about green belts. These ideas and concepts have been around for very long from an urban planning point of view, because implementation becomes very, very hard. So yeah, as I said, there is no easy solution to responding to climate change, because all of these lay increased burden on municipal governments, increased burden on need to find land, supply of land. Supply of land can only come from what is currently agricultural becoming converted to non-agricultural, and that is a constant challenge. So you've seen in Andhra, for example, they were talking about land pooling and things like that, where an economic thing was thrown to kind of take land and offer serviced land, which is much more valuable. So I think, of course, inventive financial methods or, land, let's just call it land restructuring methods, definitely one way, given that's the most, difficult resource. And of course, of late, we've been seeing governments have predominantly relied on land-based financing for urban infrastructure and urban growth. So whether land value capture in that sense, whether it be TDR, be it impact fee, be it selling FSI, and so on. I think one thing that could definitely come in, I think, is understanding real estate markets better and be able to learn how to financially gain from it. For example, the US tax increment financing is a fairly popular thing where you transfer the burden of, let's say, the market speculation to the person or to the developer or the company that's coming in to build. And effectively, the government has zero costs at that point and are pretty much writing that off based on a future tax escalation. So in a way, the market kind of takes the risk, the market gains in the long term, and effectively it allows for much faster, much more efficient deployment of capital and better cities.
Yeah, thank you. That's quite insightful on those lines. So, are there any best case practices or something on the international level as well? Because I'm assuming this is not the problem that only India faces, and this is everywhere in the world. So, any ways that these things have been managed and these things have been just managed? I'll just put it that way.
Again, it's a very hard one, and I think I keep coming back to how inventive finance, tools or policies are the way. So, I mean, if I take the case now, this is a very controversial thing. Take the case of Boston, for example. Sea level rise is a major issue there. We've actually seen where there's a massive parking lot by the sea, and the water came in the winter, and it froze, and there were cars stuck in ice for a couple of weeks, and it's pretty crazy situation that is being hit by polar vortexes much more often. And the government's response is, they won't say let's ban building in the Seaport District, because the Seaport District is the fastest growing financial hub, the new age real estate hub in the city, and the government gets tremendous tax revenues from there. So they won't want to stonewall it. But what they're actually doing is literally walling it. So they've been able to, come up with this idea of creating a sea barrier, which is a humongous infrastructure investment. Almost like preventing the waves from coming in by building a massive concrete thing. And it is extremely expensive, but they know it can be easily funded based on the real estate growth that is expected there. Right. So they may say economically it's justified. We have an engineering solution to climate change, and this might last for some, maybe a 50 or 70 or 100-year projection, and then we'll see. Whereas I know a lot of MIT professors came out very strongly against these kinds of things, saying most of Boston would get flooded, and we know Boston was never, most of Boston, in fact, as we know today along the edges, is all landfilled. So whenever they did it, they knew it was going to be flooded, much like Bombay, it's pretty much artificial land made around. So as long as they know the financing is coming in, they will come up with engineering solutions. And of course, ecologically, it may or may not work. Then you have to kind of do micro planning, upstream, literally upstream, and see what to do. The other thing one talks about is if you do not want to go in for heavy engineering solutions, can we talk about disincentivizing unsustainable or non-green infra, and whereas invest in what is green infra, talk about green bonds and things like that. Again, it's about inventive financing. It's about putting high regulatory costs on certain kinds of behaviors. Because the only way really to do it is to incentivize the markets to do it. So there's another project which I'm remembering again in the US is where how do you treat the edges along rivers? Because there's suppose a river or a channel that's going across multiple cities. If each city starts to decide what they want to do with it, you're going to have an ecological mess. I mean, there's variety of reasons why there was so much of conversation around the Sabarmati riverfront and essentially bringing Narmada water here and things like that. So I mean, some cases, of course, internationally are talking about how do you allow that thing? How do you have certain set of rules that your banks have to be permeable? This is a certain kind of infrastructure, public recreation that has to come around it. So it is not a city-based plan, but it is a plan that is shared across 6 cities along that river, and the decision making comes from the state. I mean, of course, Korea also we know very well the Cheonggyecheon project, where they literally opened up an ancient stream which had been built over. Uh, I don't know if you're familiar with this, so, but it had been built
No, I'm
over
not.
by a major highway and then multiple layers of flyovers, and they finally demolished all those layers of flyovers and uncovered the stream, which has now become a major recreational hub in the city.
Okay.
And even their policies for how to go around along the riverfront or how to manage the riverfront is not a one-time solution that says let's apply this uniformly for every localized zone around the river. They have a certain kind of an idea what is the need of that area, what is the best technological intervention. If it's a greenfield site, if it's a brownfield site, how do you go about it? So I'm guessing a lot more attention to detail rather than one size fits all solutions have been the other way to intervene. Again, it all keeps coming back to how is it financed, how is it funded, who's funding it, the central funds, local funds, how are they raised, what's the cost of capital. So anyway, so I keep
Yeah.
coming back to saying inventive financing.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, but it does look like that to solve this, this is one of the migration is one of the problems which is ingrained in the real estate as well, in some format or the other. And that does bring it to the point that how do we manage our resources in a better way. So coming to one of the final questions that we generally come around is, what are the different kinds of skill set required to work in this area, because this area seems to be much more complicated than normal, because it's a lot of social or societal context to it. But then there is a lot of work that also happens directly in our day-to-day life. So what kind of skill sets do you feel are important to work in this field and help in this field?
By field, you mean climate change or urban sector
Migration.
in general?
Yeah, migration in general.
I mean, see, conventionally, migration has been seen from a rights perspective. Labor rights, human rights, poverty alleviation. So of course there is that whole development, non-profit or the whole big NGO sector, labor-oriented NGO sector that's active. Now, the moment you start talking about employment, now again, there are various pieces to it, right? I mean, you can talk about urban planning, you can talk about livelihood generation, you can talk about healthcare, education. So if these are all the needs, and I think each of those, depending on which of those fingers or which of those aspects you address, there are specializations, right? Now, when you talk about absolute basic needs related to urban development, it is, I mean, that's what our hypothesis, our thesis is that it is employment and housing. These are the two things. And so again, from a very, very personal perspective, I felt, having trained as an architect and then an urban planner and then kind of specializing even more in real estate and, real estate finance, I thought finance was definite for any urban development professional. I thought understanding of finance and the investment kind of points of view is very, very critical. This includes public finance, which is, how do governments raise money? How do they manage their money? How do they regulators become very, very important, because regulation is in a way one way to make money without actually investing in it. You ban something and you take an impact fee, like, or you disallow or you allow FSI, things like that. So I think understanding of public finance, urban finance, super critical. Second is, what are the sources of capital? So I think that I, for example, all took classes on impact investing, on public finance, and a lot on private equity investment in the urban sector. And then again, so these days you talk about blended finance. How do you given the size of the project and things like that? And how does, of course, a private equity investor think? Because at the end of the day, if there is always something called need, but how does need become demand? And because when need becomes demand, markets will rush to fulfill that.
Yeah.
And I think that's also one of the hypotheses that the Omidyar network started in back, the peer Omidyar, the famous conversation that, that's talked about. So I think that's definitely a skill. Second, I mean, one cannot underscore enough a basic skill set in knowing how to use technology and because data, I mean, data is everywhere. Big data pretty much is available with, and there are so many insights you can generate from that, which you could earlier. I mean, you always had remote sensing and things like that in the urban sector, but now people are deploying machine learning to remote sensing and several other GIS kind of applications. So that is definitely one set of tools. If you're not an expert, and at least know what could be deployed, what are the data sources available, what are the insights and learnings that could be brought from it. So, some of our work, let's say consulting work that we did as students for certain governments, we tried to bring in expertise in data science, in GIS, accompanied with the expertise in investment and finance, pretty much underwriting, large investments or something for the city. So how do you bring those things together? Big data, how does an investor think, and then this expertise in machine learning and GIS. And this for us seems like the frontier that could majorly transform how we manage climate change for large cities or geographies.
Okay, thank you. That was quite a good comprehensive review of what all things would be required for skills, specifically on the skill set lines. Any points if I have missed out and you would like to cover in this sector, that would be, you can take it as right now.
I can't really think of too much off the cuff, but I think the only point I'd like to underscore here again is while as policymakers, as planners, and architects, any built environment professional, we are always looking at end state static solutions. For example, saying if so many people are coming, we're going to build housing for them. And I think we've learned, of course, the past couple of decades that static end state solutions are not necessarily going to be able to cope with the pace at which our country is growing, our cities are growing. We have to design for the transitions, because nothing else, people are constantly in transitions. Of course, everyone hopes to get to a steady state end solution, but can we help the transitions better? And I think that is critical to climate change, because things are going to change very, very quickly and constantly.
Yeah.
And how it is. So, when you talk about future of work, just to kind of give a corollary to that, talk about future of work, you always talk about how when a new technology is introduced, you see, the growth curve first will decline because people are adapting to it. And then it starts to pick up after people have made that transition to new technology. It helps boost things faster. Now, with climate change, we're possibly going to be thrown with the need to constantly reinvent constantly. That means our productivity, our ability to get out of it is constantly going to be at a decline. So unless we focus only on the transition to begin with, the long term is constantly going to be in question.
I absolutely agree with you over there. We have to be constantly innovative in whatever approach we take. Otherwise, we will not be able to sustain the constant change that nature will throw at us.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for example, the AHRC was perhaps a great initiative to begin, because you realize that the need for housing is not necessarily permanent in that place. And rental housing actually does offer a zone for transition. It's not like a migrant just came to the city, let me give him a free house. Perhaps he can live on rent for 3 or 4 years at nominal rent, get into the urban economy, get a stable wage, and then at that point, perhaps you've enabled him to access or own property, whether it's off market or it's affordable under the government. So I think those are the kinds of initiatives, and yeah, I think technology is definitely going to bolster the cause.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking out time and interviewing with us. It was absolutely a delight for me to understand this topic in a better depth than I knew of. And thank you for taking out time, Rushil.
Thanks. It was a pleasure, and I hope I didn't ramble on too much.
No, no,
Off the record, I hope we can edit or whatever you felt went on too long.
No, no, not a problem, because it's. I think those ramblings are the point where you understand a field in a better way than any other way, because that's your knowledge and that's your experience from your past. So that's there for sure. Thank you so much, Rushil.
You have been listening to Understanding the Future podcast. To know more about Climate Center for Cities, check out our website www.niua.org/c-q. The show is conceptualized, produced and edited by Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate at CQ. You can now subscribe to our podcast on your favorite channel, which can be accessed through the credits. Also, don't forget to follow us on our social media for more updates. Do share your reviews with us and help us spread the podcast to your friends and colleagues. Do write to us if you would be interested in learning about any specific topics. Thank you and stay tuned for our next episode.